All right, let's unpack this. Imagine a time in the world's largest democracy when the whole system faced this unprecedented test, and not from, outside, like a war, but from deep internal issues. A time when that word emergency suddenly meant something different. Not disaster, but domestic unrest. That's the really pivotal phase we're diving into today. And here on the deep dive, you know what we do? We take a whole stack of source material, research notes, all of it. And we pull out the most important bits, the insights, the surprising facts, just for you. So today's mission, a deep dive into India's 1975 to 1977 emergency, a really crucial, very intense chapter in its democratic history. We're going to dig into the material, try to figure out why it happened, what it actually felt like, on the ground, the consequences, and what lessons the sources say were learned. Think of us as your guides through this complex stuff straight from the text we've got.
Right. And to really get a handle on this period, we need to set the scene a bit. Right. Politically, after 1971, now the Congress Party, they'd bounced back electorally, and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was incredibly popular. But the sources, they point out the party itself it had changed quite a bit. In those years, 73 to 75, they saw tensions just mounting. What the sources seem to show is this growing critique, right, from opponents. They felt politics was getting way too personalized, focused on just one leader, and this feeling the government authority was sort of being turned into personal authority. Mm-hmm. That really shaped the climate.
And you layer onto that some serious economic hardship. That Garibi Hataao remove poverty slogan from 71, it really hit home. But the reality after 71, 72, pretty tough. The sources are clear. Huge strain, 8 million refugees from Bangladesh, the war with Pakistan, the U.S. cutting off aid, and then that massive global spike in oil prices, just one thing after another. And these weren't just numbers on a page. This meant real pain for ordinary people. Inflation just shot up 23% in 73, then a staggering 30% in 74.
30%.
Yeah. Industrial growth just stalled. Unemployment, especially rural unemployment, was sky high. The government even froze salaries for its own employees. That didn't help. And then failed monsoons hit agriculture. Hard output dropped 8%. Just a perfect storm of economic problems.
Absolutely. And the sources show exactly how this economic pain, plus that political tension we mentioned, it created this fertile ground for really widespread dissatisfaction. And the non-Congress opposition parties, they tapped into this. They organized some effective popular protests, student unrest, which had been kind of simmering since the late 60s. It really flared up. And you also had increased activity from Marxist groups, Naxalites too, especially over in West Bengal, operating outside the parliamentary system.
Yeah, the source material really highlights a couple of key protest movements that became major flashpoints. Like in Gujarat, January 74. Students started protesting rising prices, corruption, and it grew. Opposition parties joined in. It led to president's rule being imposed. What's really striking, the sources say, is that under pressure, including a hunger strike by Morarji Desai, a veteran leader, they actually held fresh elections in June 75. And Congress lost in Gujarat. That was a big deal.
A very big deal.
And that momentum, it seems, shifted to Bihar, March 74. Similar story. Students protesting prices, scarcity, jobs, corruption, and the sources detail how they invited Jayaprakash Narayan JP, this widely respected figure, kind of elder statesman.
Who'd been out of politics for a while.
Exactly, to lead them. He agreed, but, crucially, only if the movement stayed nonviolent and aimed for a national scope.
Right.
And that instantly gave the whole thing much more weight, national resonance. JP wasn't just calling for the Bihar government to go, he called for total revolution.
Total revolution. Yeah, that was his phrase.
A sweeping change, social, economic, political, aiming for what he saw as like real democracy. The movement involved all sorts of actions, bans, shutdowns, garaus, surrounding officials, strikes.
And the sources make a critical point about perception here. According to the text, Indira Gandhi really believed these movements weren't just general discontent. She saw them as anti-Congress and personally targeted at her.
That's a key perspective from the sources.
And then adding another layer of trouble. The nationwide railway strike, May 1974, led by George Fernandez, demanding better bonus, service conditions for railway workers. A huge workforce.
Yeah, that must have been disruptive.
Hugely. The government's response, swift, forceful, declared it illegal, arrested leaders, even brought in the army. It was called off after 20 days, no settlement reached. But the sources stress this really fueled labor unrest generally and raised big questions about worker rights and essential services.
Okay, so, backdrop. Economic crisis, escalating protests. And at the same time, the sources show this other conflict brewing, or rather intensifying, the tension between parliament and the judiciary. This wasn't totally new, but it really came to a head here.
Right. It had been simmering for years.
The sources recap the core constitutional questions. Can Parliament just change the Constitution to limit fundamental rights? Supreme Court had said no before. Can it mess with the right to property via amendment? Court said no again. Parliament trying to amend things so they could limit fundamental rights for directive principles. Court rejected that too.
Exactly. And this long-running tug of war, it basically culminated in this landmark case. Case went on to Harati, 1973. And what the Supreme Court laid down there, as the sources detail, was the doctrine of basic features or basic structure.
The basic structure doctrine.
Meaning, sure, Parliament can amend the Constitution, but it cannot change its fundamental character, its essential features, whatever those might be exactly.
That's a huge rule.
Massive. And the sources show how this legal fight immediately spilled over into political controversy. Right after that case of Ananda judgment in 73, the Chief Justice position opened up. And the government, according to the sources, did something pretty controversial. They passed over 3 senior judges.
The ones who'd ruled against the government's position.
Precisely. And appointed Justice A.N. Ray as the new Chief Justice instead. This caused a huge uproar. Concerns about political interference, talk of a committed judiciary, one that sides with the government.
Right, mixing law and politics.
Exactly. That really heightened the tensions.
Okay, so all these things are simmering, bubbling under the surface. Economic stress, protests, this judicial conflict. And then came the trigger, the immediate spark detailed in the sources, the Allahabad High Court verdict, June 12, 1975. Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha. He ruled on an election petition filed by Raj Narain, who ran against Indira Gandhi.
Yeah, challenging her election.
And the judge ruled her election to the Lok Sabha was invalid, found her guilty of using government officials in her campaign. The consequence? Huge. Legally, she wasn't an MP anymore, which meant she couldn't stay prime minister unless she got reelected within 6 months. A massive political shockwave.
Absolutely. And the sources explain the next step was the Supreme Court, June 24th. They granted her a partial stay.
Partial. Meaning what?
Meaning she could remain an MP, technically. But, and this is crucial, she could not participate in Lok Sabha proceedings. Couldn't speak, couldn't vote.
Ah, okay. So still a major constraint.
Definitely. And this legal limbo just ignited the opposition. They were galvanized, led by J.P. Jayaprakash Narayan. They demanded she resign, flat out. The sources describe this massive demonstration they organized. Delhi's Ramlila grounds, June 25th, 1975.
That must have been huge.
It was. And this is where J.P. made that critical call for a nationwide satyagraha nonviolent resistance demanding her resignation. Even more explosive, he appealed to the army, the police, government employees, asking them not to obey what he called illegal and immoral orders.
Wow.
Yeah. The sources stress this was widely seen as a direct challenge, aiming to bring the government machinery to a halt. The whole political mood, it just turned sharply against Congress.
And the government's reaction? The sources say it was incredibly fast and dramatic. Late on June 25th, 1975, a state of emergency was declared.
Right. The constitutional basis they used, according to the text, was Article 352. But the grounds cited were a threat of internal disturbances.
Which the sources say was unusual.
Yeah, they contrast it with previous emergencies declared because of war or, natural disasters. This is about internal political unrest. Now, technically, invoking emergency powers was within the Constitution's framework. It allows for special powers in such situations. But the effects described in the sources were extraordinary. Federal power distribution, pretty much suspended. Power concentrated in the central government. And crucially, the government got the power to curtail, even restrict, fundamental rights.
So basic rights could just be suspended.
Effectively, yes. The sources frame this as an extraordinary situation where normal democratic politics just stops.
And the timeline of the declaration itself. The sources detail this, and it's quite striking. PM recommends emergency to President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, night of June 25th. She signs the proclamation immediately. Then, after midnight, the power gets cut to major newspaper offices in Delhi.
Before anything's really announced.
Exactly. And then, early morning, June 26th, mass arrests of opposition leaders, workers. Before the cabinet was officially told, they were informed at a 6 a.m. meeting. That sequence is revealing.
It really is. And life under emergency rule, as the sources describe it, changed instantly and drastically.
Yeah.
Those protests and agitations, they stopped dead. Strikes were banned. Opposition leaders, like we said, jailed in huge numbers. Outwardly, things became quiet. But the sources emphasized this quiet was tense, filled with fear.
And the suppression of rights?
Oh, absolutely central. Freedom of the press, especially. Severe censorship. Newspapers needed prior approval from government censors for pretty much everything they published.
So pre-censorship.
Yes. The sources mention some papers, Naidunya, Indian Express, The Statesman trying to protest by leaving blank spaces where censored articles should have been.
A symbolic act.
Yeah, but that was quickly banned too. Some magazines like Seminar and Mainstream just chose to shut down rather than submit, and many journalists critical of the government were arrested.
What about other groups?
The government also banned organizations. The sources mentioned the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and the Jamaat-e-Islami specifically. And any kind of public protests, strikes, agitations totally disallowed, and maybe most importantly, fundamental rights were suspended, including, crucially, the right for citizens to go to court to get their rights restored.
So the courts couldn't help. And the sources really emphasize the use of preventive detention.
Right. That's a key tool used.
Arresting people not for what they did, but because the government feared they might do something.
Exactly. Apprehension, not action.
We're talking large-scale arrests. And the sources stress those arrested couldn't challenge their detention using habeas corpuses.
That fundamental legal protection basically gone.
Yeah, the writ that says you have to bring the person before a court to justify their detention.
And that inability to challenge detention legally, it was cemented by a Supreme Court ruling in April 1976. The sources call it one of the most controversial judgments ever. The court overruled several high courts that had tried to provide relief. It accepted the government's argument, effectively saying that during the emergency, the government could take away a citizen's right to life and personal liberty.
Wow.
And the courts couldn't intervene. It slammed the judicial doors shut for people seeking protection.
So, a very difficult time for dissent, but the sources do mention some resistance, even if it wasn't widespread.
Yes, they do. It notes that open defiance was rare by and large, given the risks. But some political workers went underground, tried to keep organizing protests, circulating information secretly.
Like underground newsletters.
Exactly, bypassing the censors. And the sources also mention some prominent writers returning state awards in protest.
Like who?
They named Kannada writer Shivarama Karanth and Hindi writer Fanishwarna Thrunun as examples, symbolic acts of defiance.
Okay, so beyond the immediate crackdown, the emergency period was also used to make some big constitutional and political changes, right? The sources talk about this.
Yes, absolutely. They pushed through significant changes. One amendment, clearly a reaction to that Allahabad High Court ruling, basically said that the elections of the Prime Minister, President, and Vice President couldn't be challenged in court at all.
Closing that door firmly.
Very firmly.
Yeah.
And then came the big one, the 42nd Amendment Act. The sources describe this as a really sweeping set of changes to the Constitution itself.
What kind of changes?
Well, one major one was extending the term length for legislatures, the Lok Sabha and state assemblies, from 5 years to 6 years.
Permanently. Not just during the emergency.
Yeah, that was the intention, yes.
Yeah.
A permanent change. And another provision allowed elections to be postponed by 1 year at a time during an emergency. So the elections that were technically due in 1976, 5 years after 71,
could now be pushed back.
Right. The sources note this effectively meant they could be delayed until 1978.
Okay, so 18 months pass under this emergency rule. Changes to the Constitution, rights suspended. Then, January 1977, the government makes a surprise move, according to the sources. They announce elections.
Yeah, quite suddenly.
Leaders and activists who were jailed start getting released, often with very little notice. And elections are set for March 1977, just a couple of months away.
It was incredibly rapid.
And the sources describe frantic political activity. Major opposition parties, many leaders had been jailed together. They quickly unite just before the polls, form the Janata Party.
A unified front, which was key.
They rally behind JP, Jayaprakash Narayan, and they get another boost when some important Congress leaders who oppose the emergency, like Jagyavan Ram,
Very senior figure.
he forms his own group, Congress for Democracy, and then joins forces, eventually merges with Janata.
Right. That added considerable weight.
Yeah.
And the Janata campaign strategy, the sources say, was simple but very effective.
What was it?
They basically turned the whole election into a referendum on the emergency itself. Focused squarely on the non-democratic aspects, the excesses, the arrests, censorship, suspended rights.
Making it the central issue.
Exactly. And public opinion, especially in North India, where the impact felt most direct and harsh, turned sharply against Congress. JP became this powerful symbol of restoring democracy. And crucially, forming the Janata Party meant the non-Congress vote wasn't split, which had often helped Congress win in the past. The sources suggest it quickly became clear Congress was in real trouble.
And the results in 77. Just stunning, according to the sources. For the first time ever since independence, Congress lost the Lok Sabha elections.
A historic defeat.
They only got 154 seats. Their vote share dipped below 35%. The Janata Party and its allies just swept in 330 seats out of 542. Janata alone got 295, a clear majority.
A massive shift in power.
And geographically, the sources point out this really stark difference. A huge anti-Congress wave across North India. They lost almost everywhere there, including Indira Gandhi losing her own seat, and her son Sanjay Gandhi lost his too.
Yes, both lost their seats. Symbolic defeats.
But interestingly, Congress held on much better elsewhere. Maharashtra, Gujarat, Orissa, they did okay. And they nearly swept the southern states.
Right. That north-south divide in the results is fascinating. And the sources offer some reasons for it. Part of it, they suggest, was simply that the impact of emergency excesses.
Like forced sterilizations, relocations.
Exactly. Those were felt much more intensely in the north. But the sources also point to deeper, longer-term changes in North Indian politics. They talk about the rise of middle castes, becoming more politically assertive, starting to move away from Congress.
And finding a home in the new Janata Party.
Precisely. So the sources argue, while the emergency was the trigger, the 77 results in the north also reflected these underlying social and political shifts. It wasn't just about the emergency.
Interesting. Okay, so Janata Party forms the first non-Congress central government. But the sources suggest it wasn't exactly a smooth-running machine.
Far from it. The picture painted is one of internal conflict almost from the start. Intense competition for PM. You had Morarji Desai, Charan Singh, Jagjivan Ram, all big figures with their own ambitions.
Right. Desai became PM, but the rivalry continued.
Yes. Morarji Desai got the job, but the power struggles didn't really stop. And the sources indicate that the main thing holding them together was just their shared opposition to the emergency. Once that was gone, they struggled to agree on much else. Critics felt they lacked clear direction, a common program. They couldn't really change policy fundamentals from the Congress era.
So unstable from the beginning.
Pretty much. The lack of cohesion led directly to instability. The sources described the Janata Party actually splitting. Morarji Desai lost his majority in less than 18 months.
That fast.
Yeah. Then there was another attempt. A government led by Charan Singh, foreign with support promised by Congress.
Congress supporting a non-Congress government.
Briefly. But they pulled their support after only about 4 months. Total instability.
And this chaos led to another election.
Exactly. Fresh Lok Sabha elections were called for January 1980.
And the outcome? Another dramatic swing.
Completely. The Janata Party, so dominant just 3 years earlier, suffered a crushing defeat, especially in the north again. And Congress, under Indira Gandhi, made this incredible comeback, almost repeated their huge 1971 win. Got 353 seats back in power.
Wow. What a roller coaster.
Indeed. And the sources draw a pretty clear lesson from that whole 1977-79 Janata period. They basically conclude that voters have very little patience for government seen as unstable, directionless, caught up in internal squabbles instead of governing effectively. They get punished severely.
Okay, so looking back at the whole emergency period now, what are the big takeaways, the lasting legacy, according to the sources we've looked at?
Well, the sources really stress that this period was a profound test for India's democracy. It showed weaknesses, definitely, but also strengths. Some observers at the time thought democracy was finished in India. But the fact that normal democratic functioning resumed relatively quickly afterwards showed, according to the sources, that actually doing away with democracy entirely in India is very difficult. There's a resilience there.
And legally, things changed too.
Yes, important clarifications came out of it. The sources note those ambiguities around internal emergency. They were tightened up. Now, it has to be armed rebellion, not just vague internal disturbance.
A higher threshold.
Much higher. And also, the advice to the president to declare an emergency now has to be in writing from the whole Union cabinet, not just the PM, adds accountability.
And what about civil liberties? That seems like a central theme.
Hugely important. The sources highlight a massive increase in awareness, public awareness, institutional awareness of just how valuable civil liberties are. The courts, for instance, having been largely unable to protect rights during the emergency, they became much more active in safeguarding civil liberties afterwards. Almost a reaction to that period.
Making up for lost time, maybe?
Perhaps. And you also saw the birth of many dedicated civil liberties organizations during and after this time.
But the sources also flag some things that weren't really resolved, right? Lingering issues.
Yes, definitely. They point to this ongoing tension, which the emergency really threw into sharp relief. The tension between, the need for a government to function smoothly, routinely, and the need for continuous political protest and agitation by citizens and groups.
Where's the balance?
Exactly. What's the right balance? What are the legitimate limits of protest in a democracy? The sources suggest these are still live questions.
And what about institutions? Police, administration?
That's another critical point highlighted, the Shah Commission, which investigated the emergency excesses.
Right, you mentioned that.
Its report, cited in the sources, found the institutions like the police and civil administration were unfortunately turned into political tools for the ruling party during the emergency. They became vulnerable to political pressure. And the sources warned that this vulnerability, this problem of political influence over neutral institutions, it didn't just vanish when the emergency ended.
A persistent challenge.
Very much so. The emergency also fundamentally changed the party system, according to the sources. Congress, which has started shifting after the '69 split, moved further away from being that old umbrella party accommodating everyone. By the early '70s, it was defining itself more narrowly socialist, pro-poor, relying on sharp divisions, and very heavily on the personal appeal of Indira Gandhi.
And the opposition.
Well, this forced the opposition parties to embrace non-Congressism even more. That strategy of just uniting everyone against Congress, that unity was crucial for their victory in '77.
Makes sense.
And the sources also point to another significant trend emerging or strengthening around this time: backward caste politics. This partly influenced the '77 results, especially in the North, leading to non-Congress state governments where backward caste leaders were key. And the Janata government then appointed the Mandel Commission to look into reservations. The sources see this period as kicking off a major process of change in the party system linked to caste politics.
So a lot of shifts happening.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the sources frame the emergency as having two dimensions: a constitutional crisis and a political crisis.
The constitutional one being parliament versus judiciary.
Yes, that battle over amending the Constitution. But the sources argue the political crisis was actually more serious, more profound, because it involved the ruling party, with a huge majority, choosing to suspend the democratic process itself. The Constitution's framers kind of relied on an implicit trust that parties would follow democratic norms, the rule of law.
And that trust was broken.
That's the argument in the sources, that trust was broken by abusing these quite open-ended emergency powers. It starkly highlighted the tension between a democracy based on institutions and rules, and one potentially driven by, unconstrained popular will or leadership.
Okay. So we've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, guided by the source material. We traced that complex build-up, the economy, the protests, the judicial fights. We looked at the declaration, the experience of the emergency itself, and then those dramatic political swings. The Janata victory, their collapse, Congress's return.
Quite a journey through the text.
It really shows, based on these sources, how this period just profoundly tested Indian democracy and reshaped it in some really significant ways, including the party system.
And those enduring lessons that come through from the text seem clear. Indian democracy's resilience, though definitely tested, the critical value placed on civil liberties now, and those ongoing tricky questions about balancing government power and citizen protest and ensuring institutions stay independent.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into what was clearly a transformative and often difficult period in history.
And maybe as a final thought for you, the listener, based on what we've explored in these sources, consider that fundamental tension we discussed between the power a government often feels it needs to maintain order and stability, and a freedom citizens absolutely need to dissent, to protest, to hold power accountable. Where do you see echoes of that same tension playing out today in democracies around the world, maybe even closer to home? Something to reflect on.